It began like any other Saturday, a quiet evening spent at Chris's house. We'd been best friends for years, the kind of friendship where words weren't always necessary and time together felt effortless. Chris's parents were out for the night, leaving the house to us, which wasn't unusual. We'd shared countless weekends like this, playing video games, eating pizza, and laughing until our sides hurt. But that night felt different. Beneath the familiar routines, there was a tension in the air I couldn't explain. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint undercurrent that made the room feel smaller, the silences between us heavier. Looking back, I realized it wasn't the first time I'd felt it, but I had always ignored it, brushing it off as my imagination. Chris had been a constant in my life for as long as I could remember. We'd grown up together, gone through awkward phases side by side, and supported each other through breakups and bad decisions. There was a natural closeness between us, one that always felt unshakable. But as the years went on, I noticed moments that felt charged in ways I didn't understand. A lingering glance, a shared laugh that lingered a second too long. I never questioned it. I couldn't. He was my best friend, and whatever those moments were, they couldn't mean anything more. Or so I thought. That night, we'd been playing games in the living room, the glow of the TV illuminating the space in flickering light. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the console. We were both stretched out on the couch, our usual banter fading into comfortable silence as the hours passed. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but I began to feel the weight of something unspoken building between us. It started small, a pause between jokes, the way his laughter seemed to trail off into thought. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but then he shifted closer, his body brushing against mine in a way that felt deliberate, and suddenly everything felt heightened. The air seemed thicker, the space between us charged with an energy I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Out of nowhere, Chris broke the silence. He started talking about graduation, how everything was about to change. His voice was quiet, almost wistful, and there was something about the way he said it that made my chest tighten. I hadn't thought much about the future, not like that anyway. But now, sitting there in the dim light of his living room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I realized, for the first time, what his words really meant. Things wouldn't stay the same. Our late-night hangouts, our constant companionship, all of it would change once we left high school. We'd move on to different places, different lives, and the thought of that made my stomach churn. He must have seen something on my face, because he hesitated before speaking again. This time, his words were quieter, more hesitant. He said something about how things between us might be different, how they might not have to follow the rules we thought they did. The words sent a shiver through me. I didn't fully understand what he was saying, not then, but I knew enough to feel my heart race. There had always been something between us, an unacknowledged spark that flared in moments like this, but we'd never spoken about it, never acknowledged it, and now, it felt like he was dragging it into the open, daring me to confront it. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying and exhilarating than the last. And then, before I could stop myself, I shifted closer to him. It was a small movement, but it felt like a monumental step, a decision I couldn't take back. Chris glanced at me, his eyes locking with mine for a brief second before darting away. My chest tightened, the moment stretching unbearably as I waited for him to say something, do something, anything. The silence between us felt alive, buzzing with everything we weren't saying, everything we didn't know how to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. He asked if I'd ever thought about what it would be like if things were different, if we didn't have to hold back, if we could just be. His words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on me, and I felt my heart race even faster. I couldn't lie to him, not about this, so I told him the truth, or as much of it as I could manage. "Yeah," I said softly. "I've thought about it." Chris didn't say anything for a moment, but his silence said more than words ever could. The space between us felt unbearably small, the air thick with the tension we'd both been avoiding for years. And then he moved closer. When Chris moved closer, it felt like the entire room shifted. His shoulder brushed against mine, a small gesture that carried an enormous weight. I held my breath, the warmth of his body next to mine sending a jolt through me. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, but the silence between us spoke volumes. For years, we had been orbiting each other, bound by friendship but skirting something deeper. I didn't know what it was, hadn't let myself think about it too much, but in that moment, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Chris's knee pressed against mine, and I felt a flutter in my chest, a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hesitant. He asked if I ever wondered what it would be like to stop holding back. His words sent a wave of heat through me, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I didn't know how to answer. Of course, I had thought about it, but saying so felt like stepping over a line we could never uncross. Still, I couldn't lie to him. Yeah, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Chris turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in his gaze I hadn't seen before, vulnerability, uncertainty, and something else that made my stomach flip. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with every passing second. And then he leaned in. It was slow, deliberate, giving me plenty of time to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His face was so close to mine that I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and steady. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding, but none of them made sense. When our lips finally met, it was like the world stopped. The kiss was soft, hesitant, almost like he was testing the waters. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire. For a moment, I couldn't think. Couldn't do anything but let myself sink into the sensation. It wasn't just a kiss. It was years of unspoken words, of feelings neither of us had been brave enough to acknowledge. Chris pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were wide, his breath uneven, and I knew he was just as overwhelmed as I was. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His words hit me like a tidal wave. I had always assumed that whatever I felt for him was one-sided, that it was something I'd have to bury and forget. But hearing him say those words, seeing the way he looked at me, it changed everything. "Me too," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. For a moment, we just sat there, our foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this feeling that I couldn't quite put into words. The second kiss was different. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was deeper, more urgent, like we were both trying to make up for lost time. My hands moved instinctively, gripping his shoulders as his fingers brushed against my jaw. I lost track of how long we stayed like that, tangled together on the couch. The boundaries between us dissolved, replaced by something new and exhilarating. It was terrifying and electrifying all at once, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to analyze or question it. Eventually, we pulled apart, both of us breathless and flushed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with understanding. I couldn't stop staring at him, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. "What now?" I asked softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Chris looked at me, his expression serious but not unkind. "We figure it out," he said simply. "Together." His words calmed me in a way I didn't expect. For the first time that night, I felt like maybe this wasn't as impossible as I had thought. The morning after changed everything. The world outside felt the same, but inside, everything was different. I woke up with a heavy awareness in my chest, the memory of what had happened the night before flooding back in vivid detail. Chris's words, his touch, the way he looked at me. It all replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't stop. I wasn't sure what it all meant. My emotions were tangled, a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. For years, We had been best friends, inseparable, and now we'd crossed a line that felt impossible to undo. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Chris. The simple words, asking if I was okay, hit me harder than I expected. I stared at the screen, debating how to respond, before typing out a short reply. The rest of the day was a blur of overthinking. My mind raced with questions I didn't have the answers to. What did this mean for us? Could we go back to how things were, or had we entered into something entirely new? And if it was new, could it survive the weight of what we'd built over the years? Eventually, Chris asked to talk, and I knew I couldn't avoid it. We couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed. The drive to his house felt surreal, every turn filling me with more nerves and anticipation. When I arrived, the air between us was thick with tension, just like the night before. He led me inside, and we sat on the couch, the same one where everything had shifted. The familiarity of the space felt strange now, like it belonged to a different time, a different version of us. I could sense his nervousness, mirrored in my own. Neither of us seemed to know where to start, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. As we sat there, the silence stretched out, and I found myself searching his face for any sign of what he was feeling. Chris spoke first, his voice steady but soft, and the rawness of his expression caught me off guard. It was clear he had been thinking about this as much as I had. His words weren't rehearsed. They were honest, full of vulnerability that made my chest ache. He didn't have the answers any more than I did, but he wanted to figure it out. The simplicity of that hit me harder than anything else. I had spent so much time worrying about what this could mean, about how it might change everything, that I hadn't stopped to consider what it might feel like to just let it happen. As he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, something shifted inside me. The touch was light, tentative, but it carried an unspoken reassurance. I turned my hand over, letting our fingers intertwine, and in that moment, the chaos in my mind quieted. This wasn't about figuring everything out right now. It wasn't about labels or answers. It was about the two of us, about taking a step into the unknown together. Sitting there, our hands linked, I realized I didn't feel alone in this anymore. Chris was with me, and whatever came next, we would face it together. The night after our talk, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the events of the past 2 days looping endlessly in my mind. Everything between Chris and me had shifted, like a door had been opened that couldn't be closed again. The weight of it pressed on me, but it wasn't crushing. It felt more like gravity pulling me into something unknown but undeniable. What struck me most was how natural it all felt. Sitting with him, hearing him speak about what he wanted, what we wanted, it didn't feel forced or out of place. It felt like a continuation of something that had always been there, something we had both been too afraid to name. When I woke up the next morning, I had a text from Chris waiting for me. It wasn't long, just a simple good morning, but it filled me with a strange sense of comfort. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of calm amid the storm of my thoughts. We saw each other that afternoon. It wasn't planned. I just found myself walking to his house like I had so many times before. When he opened the door, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation. He smiled, a small but genuine expression that made my chest tighten and let me inside. The hours we spent together that day were quiet but meaningful. There were no grand conversations or heavy declarations, just the two of us, side by side, easing into this new reality. It was strange, the way everything had changed but still felt so familiar. By the time I left, the fear I'd been carrying had started to fade. I knew there were still questions we hadn't answered, challenges we hadn't faced, but for now, it was enough to just be. The weeks that followed were filled with small, stolen moments, glances that lingered, touches that carried more weight than they used to, quiet conversations where words weren't always necessary. We didn't rush to define what was happening between us. Instead, we let it unfold naturally, letting each day guide us closer together. There were times I worried about what might come next. I wondered how the people around us would react, how this new dynamic would affect our friendship. But those worries never lingered long. Whenever doubt crept in, Chris was there, grounding me with a touch, a word, a look that reminded me we were in this together. One night, as we sat in his room listening to music, he turned to me and said softly, "I don't know where this will take us, but I'm glad we're here." His words stayed with me long after I'd gone home, echoing in the quiet spaces of my mind. And he was right. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, I was glad we had taken that first step. For years, I had told myself that nothing could ever change between us. But as I fell asleep that night, I realized something. Sometimes change isn't something to fear. Sometimes it's exactly what was meant to happen all along. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to my channel for more. Thank you for listening,